Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo murdered at least 53 people and crushed their bodies. During the 1980s, Soviet authorities were looking for a chain killer. The number of pieces that were found, all kind in one form and scattered, led the police to believe it was the work of one person, a person who would probably kill again. That person was Andrei Chikatilo, nicknamed the Rostov Story. Apparently, Chikatilo appeared to be a former Soviet citizen, a former military, and a sacrificial father of two children. In fact, he was a merciless killer. The difficult childhood of Andrei Chikatilo. Born on 16 October 1936, Soviet Union, current Ukraine, Andrei Chikatilo was born shortly after a widespread breakthrough to become known as Holodomor. He started his life in a cellar, as his parents, farmers, were trying to spend their lives. His childhood was sad and lonely, with dark shadows on him. Chikatilo's mother repeatedly told him that she once had an elder brother who was hungry and eaten by neighbors. This story hasn't been confirmed, but has had a profound and worrying impact on Chicago. As he grew up, Chikatilo's school life became as difficult as his home life. Chikatilo, with his small body, was the target of an assassin who was constantly harassed. Most of the punishment he experienced was after his father was captured in World War II. The clowns often mocked him for his father's crab during the war. Chikatilo was humiliated by his peers after a sexual assault. At the age of 15, Chikatilo tried to rape a younger girl to quench her anger. His repetitive guilt at the beginning of his life had turned him into a handless man who hated himself. During his teenage years, he tried to have several relationships, all of which ended with he was unable to have sex. He later recalls, "The girls were talking behind me and screaming that I was disabled. I was very embarrassed. I tried to wring myself. My mother and a few young neighbors pulled me out of the roof. Well, I thought no one wanted such a shameful man." How did Andrei Chikatilo become a murderer? Andrei Chikatilo, despite his childhood injuries, had relatively normal adulthood at first. He ended his compulsory military service between 1955 and 1960 and joined the Communist Party. Although Chikatilo was hand-handed with sexual disability, his sister Tanista arranged an affair between him and a woman named Fenia, who married him in 1963. They later had two children. Chikatilo even began taking courses in Russian literature and complete a 5-year course in the field at Rostov University. Not to mention that he himself taught his subject at a local night school. But there was a darker side in Chikatilo too. Soon the school manager was informed that he had sexually assaulted his young students. As a result, Chikatilo moved from one school to another before being fired forever. In 1978, he was murdered after being exposed to children. In September of the same year, the body of the 9-year-old Elena Zakatonova was found in the Grazoka River. Chikatilo later confessed to his murder, but another 25-year-old man, Alexander Krowenchenko, was found guilty of the crime and executed in 1984. However, Zakatova was largely the first victim of Andrei Chikatilo. Don't wait until dozens of others are on their way. And the police found that many of them had similar symptoms of annoying penis cuts. From 1978 to 1990, Andrei Chikatilo continued to accentuate. According to Ranker's report, his victims were often young, such as 13-year-old Lyubov Berg, who brutally murdered Chikatilo in 1982, and 10-year-old Olga Slamachinnikov, who was wounded by a knife and separated from his body in the same year. Chikatilo often found his victims at bus stations or train stations. After he led them to a remote area, he beat him and with a knife and poured flowers into their mouths. He had some of his own eyes, most of which had hidden only with a thin layer of leaves and soil. Later, Chikatilo claimed to have blinked the eyes of his victims because he feared his image would shut down after the role's death. Investigators who tracked the warring killers pointed to the members and argued that a single merciless killer was in their hands. At the time, chain killings were almost unprecedented in the Soviet Union, especially since such things were often suppressed by the state media. But in the 1980s, they could no longer deny that a chain killer had been released. In fact, Chikatilo ultimately claimed that 56 perpetrators were murdered, most of whom were young girls, although a few of them were boys. 53 cases were later confirmed. However, it took police several years to track down Andrei Chikatilo. He was arrested and released several times. His most prominent freedom came after police discovered that his blood group didn't match the fluid sample taken from the victim. It was later revealed that Chikatilo was a non-candidate, meaning that his blood group could only be determined by a blood sample. But in November 1990, shortly after the killing of his final victim, Satakurtask, Chikatilo was arrested by a gang who noticed his suspicious behavior. Nearly 20 years after the start of the row and row for his murder, the Red Rapper was arrested. Chikatilo spoke to a psychiatrist and confessed to everyone. Police were surprised to hear the number of murders Chikatilo confessed to, because they were only suspicious that he committed 63 murders. The psychiatrist said after the interrogation that Chikatilo was suitable for trial in court. He was held in an iron cage to separate him from Karathaus, where he often sank, cried, and even dropped his trousers. Despite his insane behavior, the judge convicted Andrei Chikatilo and sentenced him to death. On Valentine's Day in 1994, he was executed with a shot at his leg, something a judge explicitly taught as the only route he deserves. But even though Chikatilo was executed, his terrible legacy remains. Other Russian serial killers, including Alexander Zhivagovsky, the chess Paga killer, and chain killer Tamara Sanavova, were inspired by his horrific crimes. Who knows what Chekhov thought of this? As he said, I'm a natural error, a crazy animal. The case was closed. you're into crime stories and documentaries, subscribe to our channel because we'll be posting loads of videos every day.